How does international trade affect your life? Think about your day so far. You probably woke up to an alarm on a smartphone made in China. If you drank coffee, it was probably made from beans grown in Colombia, or maybe Guatemala. You're likely wearing clothes made in Vietnam or Bangladesh. Later today, you might even have some German chocolate made from cocoa beans grown in Ghana. That's not all. Even something intangible like education is part of international trade too, because many college students in the US are from other countries. That means the US actually exports educational services abroad. Trade may be everywhere, but it's also frequently criticised. For example, trade with low-wage countries is often blamed for declining employment in manufacturing in the US. But does the evidence support this claim? Would countries be better off if they were fully self-sufficient? The answer to that last question is clear. Economists widely agree that the trade of goods and services is mutually beneficial for society. But economists also recognise that international trade, like the advent of computers, the introduction of new products, or even changing tastes, creates winners and losers. Perhaps for these reasons, the general public is often suspicious of the net benefits of trade, and trade restrictions are a common theme on campaign trails. In an episode of EconoFact Chats, Catherine Russ of UC Davis lays out 3 of the clearest gains from trade. The first is that consumers can get more of what they want. Things like your Chinese-made smartphone or Vietnamese-made clothing. Goods like these would be much more expensive to get at home without trade. Others may just be impossible, like coffee, which can't be grown commercially anywhere in the US. But it's not just consumers who benefit. Workers in companies that use inputs from abroad, like steel, benefit from being able to produce things like cars and washing machines more cheaply. These companies and their workers also gain from being able to sell to a bigger world market, rather than just within their own country. And the same goes for farmers exporting agricultural goods and people in the entertainment industry whose shows and movies are viewed across the globe. This is true even for a country as big and rich as the United States. There are other benefits to trade too. When countries freely trade with one another, it can spur competition. By competing with companies in other countries, many thrive by finding lower costs and selling better products. But just as some companies win from trade, others do lose and are driven out of business. For companies, but also for customers and workers, trade creates winners and losers, just like other economic changes. Trade is an ambiguous good, as Paul Krugman of CUNY explains in another episode of EconoFact Chats. On the one hand, increasing trade is responsible for improving the quality of life for billions of people in China and India since the 1970s, where the economy focuses on exports for the global market. On the other hand, this arrangement hurts some workers in advanced countries who may lose their job. While trade is fantastic for the average person on the planet, it can deeply hurt specific people. That's why it's an ambiguous good. Many people point to manufacturing as a real-world example of losers from trade. US manufacturing lost more than 6 million jobs since 1980. Most of these were lost since 2000. Factories closed, and without new employers to replace them, people began to leave. When tax bases shrink like this, government revenues decline and leave less resources to reverse the trend. But this doesn't mean that international trade is the primary or even secondary factor driving declining employment in manufacturing in the US. In fact, innovation in technology plays a leading role. In an EconoFact memo, David Deming of Harvard Kennedy School illustrates the role of automation in manufacturing employment. The share of the total US workforce employed in manufacturing has been in decline since its all-time peak in the 1950s. However, the additional value created in manufacturing has been steadily rising in the same time period. This is largely due to automation, which allows firms to create more output with fewer workers. One example of this is steel production, which Russ and Lydia Cox of Harvard University explore in an EconoFact memo. Steel production was historically very labour-intensive. Masses of labourers operated vast steel mills, which always produced because their furnaces couldn't be turned off. Use of mini-mills, however, boomed in the latter half of the 20th century, presenting competition from a newer technology. They operate on a smaller scale, use more efficient heating technology, and produce to meet market demand. On the one hand, they have a much smaller carbon footprint than traditional steel mills. On the other hand, they employ far fewer workers. The steel industry has shifted to mini-mills because they're more efficient, even though it means employing fewer workers than before. But it's not just workers in steel production affected by innovation and international trade. In original research Russ and Cox did for an EconoFact memo, they found that for every job in the United States which makes steel, there are 80 jobs that depend on steel as an input. If restrictions on steel imports are imposed, perhaps intended to protect jobs in steel production, it can end up hurting far more workers than it helps. What happens to the people who lost their jobs? Well, manufacturing jobs aren't easy to replace, since they require costly factories and equipment. Infrastructure spending, which employs displaced workers, may provide a limited short-term solution, as Deming suggests. But the real difficulty reflects why those jobs located in those regions to begin with. In the mid-20th century, manufacturing jobs were relocating to regions of the US with lower wages, where it was cheaper to produce. Those new manufacturing regions had lower proportions of educated workers. As new technologies were introduced, employment began to decline. But intensifying global competition through trade in the late 20th century rapidly accelerated the decline. Russ explains that places with high shares of educated workers survived it because their workers were better able to adapt to economic shocks. Places with lower shares of educated workers suffered more severe outcomes in local labour markets. Those manufacturing jobs won't be coming back, but they do suggest a solution for making today's jobs resilient to changes in trade and technology. Investment in education and job training focused on high-skilled, service sector jobs. Economists agree that international trade is good for society, benefiting consumers, workers, and companies, but it also creates winners and losers. Ultimately, trade can only be viewed as an ambiguous good.